If you take a step back and analyze all of the top breeders in the ball python breeding hobby, these are people like Brock Wagner, Bob Vu, Canova, Ozzy, Mutation Creation. I think that there are some characteristics that all of these breeders share. And these characteristics are not exclusive to the reptile hobby, they're not exclusive to the reptile breeding hobby, but I personally think that these characteristics are things that you find all over the business world for the people that are hyper successful. So, for this week's video, what we want to do is we want to talk about the 5 characteristics of the best ball python breeders in the entire industry and go into how we can use these ideas, these concepts, in order to develop ourselves to give ourselves the best chance at success in the future. My name's Steven with Leviathan Snakes, and let's get to it. The very first characteristic that I think is fairly obvious to anybody who is looking at these breeders is that you have to have a massive amount of risk tolerance in order to even have a shot at being successful in any business, let alone the reptile breeding hobby. So, realistically, why I think that this is super important is I think that people forget that trying to start a business, any business, let alone a reptile breeding business, is inherently incredibly risky. If you are risk adverse, the idea of sinking thousands of dollars into animals that could get sick, could die, could not produce the babies that you want, maybe that they don't even produce any babies at all of these things are crazy to somebody who is very conservative with their investments, and maybe that they want to very closely stick to mutual funds or maybe bonds for their retirement, if this is the situation. And because of this, I think that what ends up happening is that a lot of really smart people who are really savvy with investments, they try to approach ball pythons and the reptile business in a similar fashion. But realistically, this doesn't really work because it ignores the idea that, one, it is way more risky to invest in ball pythons than it is to invest in just about any individual stock, and most of these people who are risk adverse aren't even comfortable investing in individual stocks. So what I think is, when you look at all of the big people, all of the most successful ball python breeders, all of them have invested incredibly heavy when they both first started out and throughout the entire time that they have been breeding reptiles. So the reason why I think that this is super important is, while it isn't necessary to drop $1 million in order to have a shot at success, at some point in your ball python breeding operation, if you have desires to be among the best, it is going to be required that you do drop substantial amounts of money at some point in your operation in order to level up and get to the range that these types of people are at. In addition to having a high tolerance for risk, a lot of the best ball python breeders understand how to expose themselves appropriately to the risk, so that way they are not running into a situation where they drop a ton of money in the first year, but by year 3 something else has come up and they end up having to get out before they really were able to make use of their investment. So because of this, I think that it is super important to understand what is your limit and how do you balance yourself accordingly, because even if you do come in with $100,000, if that is every single penny that you have, if that is all of your retirement accounts, if that is maxing out every single credit card that you own, I personally think that most likely somebody who does this is not going to last in the hobby, because it is very likely that some emergency will come up before they are able to really recoup their investment. And because of that, the only thing of value that they have left is the animals and equipment they have for their breeding operation, and they will most likely be forced to sell it just to handle regular things that come up in life. The best ball python breeders, they don't put themselves in this vulnerable position to begin with. They are only investing the money that they can afford to lose, and if they did use debt at any point in time in order to accelerate their growth in ball pythons, they weren't doing it in a way that put strain on themselves and their families to where they couldn't make those monthly payments. And because that they were able to be careful with their use of money and they were smart on how they were able to expose themselves to the risk, they were able to stay in long enough without some emergency coming up that pushes them out, and eventually they were able to recoup the fruits for all of that stuff that they had put in early on. The second characteristic that all of these leading edge breeders have exhibited time and time again is an incredible commitment to their work ethic. I think that it is very common for people to, when they think of work ethic, to only think about the amount of hours that somebody is putting in. And while that is definitely part of it, I think that it's more than just the hours. It is understanding what is right and what is wrong from a professional aspect, and that they may get an inquiry that annoys them for whatever reason, but it is not ethical for them to blast that specific inquiry online in front of everybody else, because they are aware of what is the right thing to do for a customer or a potential customer, as well as their audience. And if they are alienating their audience by blasting people who are potentially wanting to buy an animal from them, that is overall not a good thing for their business. And these best breeders, they understand that. They are very, very careful about their brand. And I think that a lot of newer breeders, they don't really get this. They kind of get inside their own bubble, and within their own bubble, they feel like that it is okay to essentially make fun of people for being tire kickers, or for asking a lot of questions if it deals with husbandry because maybe they're a new person, or maybe blast people because of a potential offer that they have made that was insultingly low. And all of these things can happen. And I understand that it can be frustrating because it happens to us, but by making sure that you're not publicly going out and damaging your own efforts in business, you can be upset about something, but there's no reason to have to go online and post a rant about it. Again, I think that having a strong work ethic is not necessarily just putting in the hours that nobody else wants to put in, but it's also knowing what is the right and the wrong thing to do in any given situation, and consistently always picking the right thing to do. Before I move on to the other, because I actually forgot about it while we were talking about work ethic, I also think that it is very, very common for people in the reptile hobby to get focused on things that don't matter. And often we see this on social media. People get focused on how many followers are they getting, how many views are they getting on their videos, how many likes, how many comments. And realistically, if you're not careful, all of these metrics don't really matter at all. And the best breeders understand who their target market is, and they find ways to bring their target market value. And if they know that their target market are other leading edge breeders or the level right below them that are going to be leading edge in the next 5 to 10 years, they are not worrying themselves about posting, for example, feeding videos in order to get 1 million views from people who don't own a reptile, but they think the idea of a live feeding video is interesting, because they know that those specific people are not actually ever going to probably buy a snake from them. So I think that understanding who your target market is and being ethical about how you go about making content for that target market, super, super important, and not getting focused on metrics that are kind of about vanity rather than about the business. Characteristic number 3 is that all of these people, I think, have an absolute love for learning. And this doesn't mean that they want to be in school every single second of every single day, but instead that they may come in with a passion for reptiles. But just because they have a passion for reptiles does not mean that that's all that they care about. That they get interested in other topics, whether that is marketing or photography or videography or sales. And I think that all of these things are critical, and their love for learning new skills is so important in order to establish a successful business, especially early on, because for the most part, most businesses, as they're starting out, do not have the money to go out and hire an expert in every single category that you need in order to have a shot at being successful. Instead, what happens is that these people have such a passion for learning that they themselves are willing to go out and learn enough about all of these different skills and things that are critical for their success, and that they are willing to put in the work to develop a new skill. They're willing to put in the work to be a novice and grow. And because of this, eventually what happens is that they get to the point where they are really, really good at something, and when they are making enough money, they are wise enough to go hire somebody who is even better than they are, so they can continue scaling the entire operation. Again, I think that this love of learning is 100% critical for all of the people who are massively successful in the reptile hobby. Quality number 4 is that all of these people have an intrinsic motivation that is guiding them and driving them to be successful and continue staying in the reptile breeding hobby. So when I say intrinsic motivation, I feel like for a lot of people, you could maybe interchange this with passion, but I think that intrinsic motivation is more specific, and passion sometimes can get a little watered down because of how often it is used. So the reason why I say it's intrinsic motivation is that if one of these people, if the best breeders were doing it primarily for money, that is an extrinsic motivation. And essentially, because it's an extrinsic motivation, when the market gets slow and when they wouldn't be able to sell the animals for either the amounts that they wanted to sell them for or in the volumes that they wanted to sell them for, that this would end up creating a situation where they would want to get out, because in this specific situation, they would be being motivated by an extrinsic factor that wasn't there, the money, and because it wasn't there, they wouldn't have lasted long enough to become the best. Instead, the intrinsic motivations, these are things that they have a love for the animals and that they absolutely love, going through and caring for them, holding them, seeing them every single day, day in and day out. Or it could be an intrinsic motivation to see what is the next combo that they're super, super excited about. Either one of these things or both of these things are 100% necessary in order to keep your interest in the hobby alive long enough so that way you can get to the point where you are among the best. And I think that every single one of the breeders that we have talked about so far clearly exhibits this in every single interaction that you have with them about any of their animals. Quick interruption, and that is Courtney and I have a huge announcement that we are super, super excited to share. And that is we, as of today, are launching a Patreon. Hey friends, it's Steven and Courtney with Leviathan Snakes, and this is the very first episode of our Patreon podcast. And so we've put the link down below, and there's lots of different cool things if you want to go check out the reward tiers, but there are a couple things I want to say in this specific video. And that is, we have been a member of several different Patreons, and while we love pretty much everybody that we've ever supported on Patreon, I do feel like that there is somewhat of a lack of exclusive Patreon content. So the way that we are going about this is that with launching this Patreon, we are also launching a audio-only weekly Patreon podcast where we talk about various different topics in the reptile hobby. So we actually have 3 that are live right now, or going live today. I think it's like 11, 11:05, and 11:10 is when they go up on Patreon. But that way there is some content there for you to check it out right now. The very first one is free. So anybody who just wants to see what the podcast is going to be like, you can check it out. We're super, super excited about this. In addition, beyond just the Patreon podcast type thing, we also want to talk about is that we love Miguel of Always Evolving Python's model of every single dollar that you pay into Patreon becomes a credit for a future snake purchase. So we are blatantly stealing that because it's a great idea. So every single dollar that you are paying into Patreon will be a credit towards a future snake purchase from us. And we will cover Patreon's fees, so you don't have to worry about that. So anyways, I don't want to talk about it a whole lot here right now. So head over to the link down in the description, check out our Patreon, and let us know what you think. If you want to support us, consider joining. Anyways, back to the video. The last characteristic, in my opinion, is the most important to determine whether or not somebody is ever going to be among the best. And the reason why is all of these other characteristics are necessary to get there, but you could have all 4 of the things that we've previously talked about, and if you don't have this one, I don't think that you will eventually get to the point where everybody in an industry views you as one of the leaders. And this is intuition. Before we get into how this relates to reptile breeding, I want to talk about the differences between intuition, instinct, and knowledge. So knowledge, in my opinion, is the information that you have that doesn't necessarily have an application on its own, but it is just a fact. So if we're talking about reptile breeding, this could be that you want to have a hot spot on your ball pythons of roughly 90 degrees. And this is knowledge. Once you have that knowledge, you're good to go. And if you don't have that knowledge, you could run into a situation where maybe it's too cold or maybe it's too hot, and then you could have adverse outcomes without having that knowledge. But once you have it, you are good to go. So on instinct, I think that instinct is something that you are born with. And for the most part, we look at this in animals. So if we are looking at animals, specifically ball pythons, and we want to look at an example of instinct, this would be a hatchling ball python who has just come out of the egg or maybe just had their first shed, knowing how to eat without being taught. That is instinct. Then lastly is intuition. And the way that intuition differs from the other things is these are essentially guesses. You don't know for sure, so it's not knowledge. This is a guess. And you are not born with intuition. Instead, I personally believe actually, that as you get older, as you get more experience, as you get more information, your intuition improves. So because you're not born with it and you can improve it over time, it is a skill that can be developed. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about intuition specifically. Intuition is when you can take information, and this information can really be from anything. It can be from life experience, it can be from research, it can be conversations with other people, it could be YouTube videos, it could be simply looking at pictures on Instagram of different combinations of genes, and taking all of this information and then forming a somewhat informed guess on what you think is the answer to some question that you have in mind. Maybe that question is, how will this specific combination of genes look that's never been hit before, based off of all of the information that you have? And if you are able to correctly predict roughly how it will look, or at least that it will look cool time and time again, this is a characteristic that you see all the time in the best breeders. But I think it extends beyond just simply finding out which genes are really going to work together or not. I think that intuition actually is so much more important for understanding the market, because if you can identify what roughly the hobby is going to want to buy in 3 to 5 years from now, you can buy the animals, or you can breed for the animals that you need right now, because it takes 2 to 3 years to grow up a female ball python. So that way, when the market is at that point that you are predicting, you hopefully, based off your intuition, guessed correctly and are able to be one of the only people with those animals that are super, super high in demand. And again, I think you can see this time and time again with the best breeders. They are consistently, it's not that there's one season where they make an amazing combo and it sells really quick and then you never hear from them. It is every single year people like Canova, people like Brock Wagner, like Ozzy, like Mutation Creation, like Bob Vu. They are every single year making amazing combos that light the entire industry on fire. And it is this intuition, understanding what things will look good together and understanding what the market is going to want to buy in 3 to 5 years, is so critical to their success as some of the best breeders in the entire industry. So I think that being able to develop your intuition, and you don't necessarily have to go out and buy a $10,000 animal and a $20,000 other animal and breed them together in order to do this. You can do this just simply by thinking about your specific segment and figuring out what your specific segment, whether that's pet owners, entry-level breeders, enthusiast-level breeders, leading-edge breeders, what they are going to want in 2 to 3 years. You can do this with a very, very small budget, and if you are successful, you will dominate that space. So all of these things said is, I think that the people that we've talked about in this video are doing amazing things for the industry, and there is a reason why they are the best. And I don't think that just because they are the best, there is no room for anybody else to join them at some point in time. And if you are able to develop these skills that we've talked about, that might be you 3, 5, maybe even 10 years down the road. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe, and we will see you next week.